welcome everyone. Welcome to Big View. My name is Alice Morin and I direct community engagement programming at Kutaska Community Action. Kutaska, our history, we are part of the National Community Action Movement that was born out of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty in the 1960s, and the advocacy work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. around equal rights and access to opportunity that also had a great influence on the roots of community action. Kutaska has a variety of programming to assist low-income people in our service area of Itasca and Kutchiching County. You're familiar with many of these programs, such as Head Start, energy assistance, crisis housing, teenage parent programming, home ownership, circles of support, and more. Also, you may have heard that Kutaska just opened an early childhood hub in the old Murphy School building. So that's a project we are really proud of. Circles of Support is about social support for people who are struggling with poverty-related issues in our area. We have specific social support activities that take place 3 times a week in our office. And our office is open 5 days a week for food, for social support, for direction, to warm up. That is a thing this time of year. To charge your phone, for a hot cup of coffee, for friendship, and for hope. We also operate a food pantry out of our office location, so it's a convenient food access point in our community. In the month of October alone, people in poverty visited our office nearly 300 times. So that area of our work is led by Carter Starling. Carter, can you wave? So all of those conversations that are had with people in poverty, that is where Big View work comes from. And that's what we're here for today, is Big View work. Amy Bloomquist. Amy, can you wave? Everyone's met Amy. Amy leads registration, events set up, and partner connections that make Big View happen. And she's also deeply involved in those conversations with poor people about what life looks like when you're struggling to meet your basic needs in Itasca County. So our Circles of Support social assets programming informs and gives us credibility to do our Big View work. Community action agencies are designed to fight poverty, and we cannot fully address poverty without addressing the social conditions that are contributing to keeping people poor. So Big View does just that. Through Big View, we're attempting to break down the stereotypes and change the narrative about low-income people in our community by helping our community better understand the systemic nature of poverty. A recognition of place. At Kutaska, we acknowledge that our agency and work is located on land that was cared for by Ojibwe, Dakota, and other indigenous peoples who were here before anyone else that we're going to hear about tonight. So I just want to make that point. And then on to today. How did we get here? Today is part 3 in our series on Iron Range history, racism, and immigration. You know, we see folks who are feeling like they're not part of the conversation about racism and immigration, or perhaps they have just shut down. Those conversations have become fairly polarized in our area, in our world, and I think sometimes that people forget, or maybe they just don't realize, that they too come from people who came from somewhere. And we all have a story, and many of our stories are filled with struggles and challenges faced by generations before us. And the history of the Iron Range is full of these stories. We at Kutaska are not experts in this topic matter, so we turn to someone who is. Aaron Brown. Who doesn't love it when Aaron Brown comes up with something new? I mean, we love reading Aaron's stuff about the things that matter to the people of the Iron Range. Aaron is a 19-year faculty member at Minnesota North. He is a published and award-winning author of Iron Range history and has covered northern Minnesota as a journalist and columnist for 22 years. Welcome, Aaron.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. Yeah, I cringe at that word expert, because actually what tonight is me stepping out of my expertise just a little bit based on some new things that I learned. And so that's the tone I'd like to begin with. I have some background in Iron Range history, but my most recent project is something that led me down some new avenues. So let me just set the scene for you. It's the COVID-19 pandemic. Like many of you, perhaps, I was home a lot during this time. Working from home, my kids were home, my wife was home, everybody's home. My wife and my son George and I crafted a really awesome world on Animal Crossing New Horizons, a great new island. It's a video game, not the right crowd for that, sorry. It was really cool, trust me on this. I perfected a banana bread recipe that used less butter somehow and was still good. Nevertheless, I gained 30 pounds during that time and found myself mostly sitting at a microfilm machine that was in my basement, looking at a period of time that ranged from 1913 to 1926. And my interest in looking back at this time was really related to one man, Victor Power, mayor of Hibbing, who is not the subject of tonight's talk. I've given other talks about him. But what I was interested in about Victor Power, the man who fought the mining companies as mayor of Hibbing back in the 19-teens and 20s, was really the interesting political dynamic that existed about 100 years ago in the towns of the Mesabi Iron Range. And my focus is Hibbing, and I know Hibbing's not Grand Rapids, and you know there's hockey and all that. But I use Hibbing really just as an example, as the test case for what I was really writing about, which is that interaction between people who have power and people who don't. And that was what interested me. That's why the book is called Power in the Wilderness, as for Victor Power, but also for the small p, power. And the wilderness refers to the place where we live, certainly as it was seen by many at the time we're talking about. Though, to be fully accurate, as was stated, people were already here hundreds of years before in settlements. But for the people coming off the trains to the mines, looking out the edge of their town, to them it was truly an unending wilderness. So this is the stuff I started looking for, and this is actually, I don't know if you noticed the subtle humor in this headline. I was interested in the ways that they were finding ways to make Hibbing independent from the mining companies, trying to build a strong, economically diverse town, things that reminded me of things we talk about today that we would sure like to do, but that were challenging to do. They were doing it, so what were they doing? That was what interested me. I like that they say attractive city is the best way to bring new business to Hibbing, but there's also a suicide added to the murder at Chisholm. Some subtle Hibbing Chisholm humor there for those who are willing to go there. But actually, that pervasive edge of murder, suicide, of suffering was actually one of the most disturbing parts about my research. I mean, we know there was suffering in the past. There's suffering now. But the persistent nature of the suffering of these people who were coming off the trains from all over the world and the world that they lived in was, I mean, even when you had a really funny story or interesting story on the front page of the paper, you couldn't avoid that part. It was always going on. So I was looking for economics and politics, but what I'm here today to talk about is something a little more challenging. This is the headline the day after the 3 men were hanged in the streets of Duluth in 1920. And it was big news, but this is the biggest headline that says that, but one of the things, I mentioned the disturbing things that you see in the old newspapers. I saw reference to a black person being lynched almost every day in the daily newspapers through this period, mostly Associated Press copy from the South, but not exclusively. So if we're going to look back at our past, we have to, maybe take a wider view of it and a more open-minded view of the stories that get passed down. I think I said this morning, the past becomes kind of legendary once all the people who saw it are gone. And then from the legend comes a lot of myths, ideas we have about how it must have been. But it's, it worked. Oh, I didn't think it would work. I'm so excited. My wife teases me, and of course this is why the book is not done yet. It's almost 8 years now, 7 years, almost 8 years and counting, is because when I think about a story like I just described, I have to start at the very beginning. And that means a distant, not even the Big Bang, this is the explosion of a distant star. The nuclear process at the core of the star grew so heated, and the elements that were being produced so heavy. In fact, the final element that tips a star into supernova is iron. Yeah, okay. Carl Sagan made the joke already that we are, no, it was Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I think Carl Sagan made it before that, we are stardust. Because stars exploded, and they sent out all this stuff, including a heck of a lot of iron, out into the universe. And our planet formed. This is why the book is so long and why it's still not published. I just have to make that clear. Because this shouldn't have anything to do with it. But I am compelled. Marvin Lampa, the great Iron Range historian, also liked to start from the standpoint of the distant stars exploding. So Earth forms. You got your molten ball of lava, which is actually mostly iron. And I got to skip over some parts. So there's a giant mountain range over our region, the biggest in the world at one time. Huge mountains, very tall, bigger than the Himalayas and the Alps. And then the glaciers came and they rolled those mountains over many, 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 many millions of years. And then after the glaciers, the last glacier receded, a big inland sea formed right over our area. And all that iron that was in all of that material that got scraped up by the glaciers settled to the bottom of that inland sea. And then a little bit more stuff came on top of it, and then the seas evaporated and drained away, forming the Mississippi River and other things that we know today. The Great Lakes remain, and just below the surface of what we now call the surface of the earth was some of the richest iron ore in the world. And that's why a lot of people came here about 100 years ago. This is a really interesting painting. John Michael Cook did this painting for St. Louis County. It's the Hill of Three Waters. This is, in his vision of this is a depiction of the three-way watershed near Hibbing that sends water to Hudson's Bay to the north, to the St. Lawrence Seaway, Lake Superior and the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. It's one of the handful of three-way watersheds on our continent, and this one has special cultural significance because it was also an important part of the histories of indigenous tribes in this area, especially the Ojibwe, who used it as a meeting place during conflicts, and there were a lot of conflicts pre-colonization here in our region. And so the thing that's unspoken when you look at this is that you're looking at Hibbing taconite in this picture, and what is there in this picture, as it is imagined, is long, long gone. It's a completely different landscape. But that rock is still there, and you can, well, it's really hard to get in there to go see it. I had to manipulate people, and then I had to violate an agreement with a mining company to write about it. And so not everybody is willing to do those things. But I nevertheless did. And so this just kind of tells you where we were just before this part of the story started. Now, if I were going down the road of my book, I would go down this road and I'd tell you, oh yeah, there's those Merritt brothers. They discovered the iron ore of the Mesabi. They were the first to ship it commercially. And in fact, the Merritts would have been the greatest industrialists of Minnesota history. All of that beautiful iron ore money would have stayed in Minnesota because they were Minnesota guys through and through. Uh-oh. But the problem is they were broke, which is actually a problem we hear about with entrepreneurs today. They had a lot of great ideas and they were very hardworking and all of that, but they did not have enough money to keep going through the financial hardships of big industry. The one who did is that other guy up there in the corner, John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller basically took over the range from the Merritts, particularly using the advantage he had owning the shipping that shipped iron ore out of the region. John D. Rockefeller, very shortly after that, just a few years, joined with other industrialists, J.P. Morgan, and of course Andrew Carnegie, who held most of the country's steel holdings. And they formed the multi-headed beast that we now know as U.S. Steel. And in 1901, U.S. Steel became the world's largest corporation to a degree that staggered the mind of the people at the time. There was U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar capitalized company, in 1901. And then way, way down, you'd have to find the second-place company. They were so big that people couldn't fathom how big they were. And in doing this, the Mesabi Iron Range opened to some of the most aggressive mining and shipping the world has ever seen in the business of iron ore. And that down in the corner is Lon Merritt. If you look up on the top left of the family picture, he's a jaunty young man with the world ahead of him. He died in 1926, a rather grumpy old man, as you can see in the picture, because he had it. They worked like dogs, and they couldn't quite close the deal. But that's a story about ambition and desire, and that's not really what I'm here to talk about. I'd like to take a different off-ramp on this story. This is another painting I really like, depicting the old white pine forests before they were logged. And this picture shows, in some ways, of course there's no photographs of this, but there was a man, Richard L. Giffen, who was one of the first people to come to the one of the first white men to come to the Mesabi Iron Range in 1891. He came to Mountain Iron, really on the heels of the Merritt brothers. And as he arrived in Mountain Iron on one of the tall hills near town, he described what he called an ocean of pine. And so he's looking down over this scene. And if you can just imagine what a white pine looks like, we get smaller ones these days. They have the blister rust and the other things that cause white pines not to regenerate as well as they used to. But these were mature white pines, like the ones you see up at the Lost 40. And there were so many of them that you could look out over them, their tops blowing in the wind, and it looked like a green pine ocean. That's what the scene was, right as something awesome in the literal sense, terrifying, terrible, monumental was about to occur. And so that's where we're starting this story. We know from our study of the indigenous cultures who lived here before that this region was bountiful but also very challenging to live in. And the way that the Ojibwe and the Dakota before them and other people before them handled it was through seasonal encampments. You go to a place where it's good to spend the winter, and then you go to a place where it's good to spend the summer, because those are not the same places. And so you have seasonal camps. There were some year-round locations that they had, but a lot of their encampments were seasonal. This was the smart way to handle living here in the way that they lived. This was the most prudent way to do it. When white men, first traders from France and then later loggers and land developers came, they wanted those logs. That ocean of pine looked pretty valuable, and it was. And you can, of course, as Itasca County, I'm presuming things, but you log in the winter because the ground is frozen, and you can move those logs. And that's what you had to do. Moving them in the summer is not going to happen. They sink right in the mud. So logging, which came first, was winter work, which was seasonal, which meant that we weren't really seeing a lot of permanent towns take off in the 1870s, 1880s. There were a few logging camps that were located in the area, sometimes on the same site as current towns, sometimes in other places entirely. When they discovered iron ore, because of logging, because of the clear-cut logging that they did, they were able to get at the dirt under the tree canopy even better. That's one of the legends of the Merritts, is that they found the first deposit of iron ore under the root system of an old white pine. And And so once mining became a viable business, mining is a summer work. At this time, mining was summer work only, because in the winter, the ground freezes and it's much harder to dig up that nice soft ore. But you can go work in the logging camps in the winter, and then you can mine in the summer. And now all of a sudden, we have the ability to live in northern Minnesota in permanent European-style towns. These were, you know, things that were kind of thought impossible to support in an environment like ours.
What year was that?
This would have been when the mines started shipping in the 1890s. And if you look at the history of our range towns, as you go west or east from Grand Rapids, you're talking about 1893 for Hibbing. Mountain Iron is 1891, something like that. I don't have it off the top of my head. But then you see other range mining towns come in the very early 1900s after U.S. Steel started. So there was a period like 2006, 2007, 2008 where you saw all of these centennials rolling through our local communities. And that's because that was when the permanent mining operations were moving in. So what this means is that now people can live here. And that means that the ore is a commodity, yes, but labor is now something incredibly important to what they need to do. The Merritts and their hired hands and their helpers, Captain Nichols, their mining captain that they brought, and a handful of workers and their cousins, you know, these little crews could dig up and ship a little bit of ore. But what they really needed was to move shiploads of ore. And at this time, there are steam shovels, there are larger equipment, there's stuff happening, but you need a lot of people to work with literal spades, with hand equipment. There were underground and above ground mines, pit mines. The pit mines were what the Mesabi was known for. And those pits, I mean, you needed all of these people to shovel material into different places. The equipment wasn't good enough and big enough like it is today to do it all in an automated way. There were 10 workers to every 1 worker we have today in the mining industry mining the same amount of ore that we mine today. That's something that I'm not sure everybody is aware of. They're moving about the same amount of ore today. They just do it with 1/10 of the workforce. But back then they needed the workforce, and that's why they needed people. This is 1913. That was the year I started my research, so this was one of the first years that I found clippings like this. And this tells a story if you're looking for it, or as it revealed a story to me. These are in chronological order. On the left side here, you see January 1913. Labor may be hard to get. So 1913 was a big expansion year around Hibbing, but also around the Mesabi Range. They were really trying to expand the capacity of these local mines. And they had been bringing in immigrant workers since the early 1900s. So this is like 10 years after immigration had started. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that, and it's really evident from the newspaper articles, workers who came to America, maybe contrary to some of the legends we have, were not coming like, well, again, this is a dated reference for people my age. They weren't coming here like Fievel, the little mouse from An American Tale, with that kind of pie-eyed notion of we're leaving a terrible place to come to a wonderful place. And if we work hard enough, you know, and survive this journey, we get to be Americans. A lot of workers came in a way that might seem familiar. They came to make some money so that their family would survive, because they couldn't get the money in their home country. And they came, many of them, with the idea of getting some money through work and then going back home. This was very prevalent. I like to joke, like, you know, if you're descended from an Iron Range European immigrant today living in northern Minnesota, you've got a distant cousin back in your great-great-grandfather's homeland who is descended from one of his relatives who said, "Not for me, I'm going back." And these folks, some of them went back during World War I to fight for their home, whatever side of the war they were on. So a lot of people went back. But that meant that it was a transient labor force. It reminds me a little bit of the fruit picking stories you hear in contemporary times, where I happen to know somebody who owns a farm that picks fruit. She hires migrant workers to pick her cherries. And she has a series of families that they've worked with for years who come one time a year to pick fruit. But if economic conditions are different, if something's different back where they're from, or if they have a better offer somewhere else, her entire labor force does not show up when it's harvest time. And so this was the environment the mining companies were dealing with as the immigrants were going back and forth back in these times. Okay, so there's a chance a lot of these miners won't come back. Remember, it was seasonal. Shortage of labor feared. Austria, and that refers mostly to what would later be called Yugoslavia and what we now call countries like Croatia, Slovenia, and Montenegro, and those places. Austrian and Italian people, who were some of the later immigrants, and I'll get to what that means, but they were not coming back at this time. Maybe they had better options back home. And then, on the end, that's January, February, April. April's when they're starting to mine, or they'd like to. Maybe it sticks into May. We know how spring and winter is here, you know. Just imagine you're a mine owner, and the difference between, a good year and a bad year is when exactly that ground thaws out. April 18th, 1913, colony of Austrian people coming Sunday. Let me explain to you how this happened. In fact, the gentleman is right there in the front in that story, Paul Morris. He was a Croatian, and he ended up in another side of the story, and what will be in my book, he ended up being one of the great bootleggers on the range, one of the most powerful bootlegging families on the range. 4 brothers came, all owned bars. Very powerful anti-prohibition family on the range. But in these times, Paul Morris was a Croatian saloon keeper who had a magical gift, and that was he could speak English. He learned it from the monks at a Catholic church back in Croatia. So Paul Morris was hired by the Oliver Iron Mining Company, U.S. Steel, to go back to Austria and recruit workers to come here and to tell them whatever he had to tell them to make it seem like a really good idea. Paul Morris got a bonus for every man he sent home or sent back to Hibbing, and he got a bigger bonus if it was a family or a couple. Married men were worth more because they were considered more reliable. Paul Morris, this is another aside, had a friend named Victor Power, the gentleman from my story, and Victor Power was a lawyer, and they siphoned a great deal of money off of this process by reporting immigrants who did not actually exist. But that's neither here nor there. But they did bring in a lot of people this way. The mines were consciously going to other countries to bring these people here. But what kind of a life awaited them when they got here? I'm actually not convinced that this is a bad house. I think this is kind of an average house. This is one of those shacks you see on the range. This was taken in Hibbing. These are, yeah, it's all right. It's a pretty good house for the time. The floor is either dirt or subfloor. I can't quite tell. They have some nicer furniture. Of course, the wood stove. There were 2 stoves in most houses, the one in the great room, and usually one in the kitchen. And so every house had 2 smokestacks. And this is a pretty okay house. It's not finished inside the way we would see it today. It's open design. It's obviously not very well insulated. This is, like I said, in the middle of the scale. They got a lot worse than this. The tar paper shacks, and then the boarding houses. The boarding houses were where the single men lived, and most of them, especially in those 19-teens, were, the beds were always warm, they said, because you didn't rent a bed or a room, you rented 8 hours or 12 hours of a bed. And when you got up to go work your shift, some guy coming off his shift was going to go crawl into the same bed. And this would go on for years this way. And so housing was an issue, finding places to live. Keep in mind, this is a place just as cold as it is today, maybe colder. And a lot of the amenities that we now really take for granted. I mean, I drove here in a car, my butt was warm because I had a heated seat. And I was comfortable. I was a little hot driving over here from Hibbing in 40 minutes in a car that goes faster than anything they had at the time. And there were a lot of these amenities that, 100 years later, we just don't even realize how profound the warmth we have access to. Even in public places, we have access to warmth that did not exist at this time. And of course, Croatia, if you're especially from the coast, it's not tropical, but it's very temperate. I mean, very, very nice. It's a vacation hotspot for the people of Europe today. It's beaches, it's swimming, it's bathing. And you come to northern Minnesota, and you're now suddenly in a very cold place with a language, primary language you don't speak, and you've signed on to work in a mine that, your bosses won't speak your language. You're likely to be paired with a worker from another country who speaks an entirely different language. Probably the most famous example of this story that I heard once was the story of, I don't know if it was Croatian or Slovenian or one of the Austrian peoples, as they were called, because it was the Austrian Empire, was working in an Iron Range mine and said, I'm going to learn English. And he says, I'm going to learn it, my coworker, my partner at work speaks English, and he's going to teach me words. And so every day his coworker would teach him a new word. And he would come back to home, and he'd teach his kids, he'd teach his wife all the new words each day. And it was a long time before he finally realized that he was being taught Finnish. Because his friend was Finnish and was teaching him Finnish. So, but just imagine, not only are you in a country where the bosses and the powerful people speak a different language than you, but there are a couple dozen languages being spoken. And the mines were deliberately pairing people who didn't speak the same language. And that comes back to some of the notions that I want to talk about today with power. The mining company knew what it had when it formed U.S. Steel. It wasn't the only mining company, by the way. There were other independent mining companies. And I know, if you get into the mining history, you'll hear about the history of Cleveland Cliffs and the history of some of these Winston Deere Stripping Company and all these local companies that existed that were not U.S. Steel. But U.S. Steel was the driving force, not only in Iron Range mining, but in American industry writ large, the whole works. And immigration was part of their power play. American labor wanted up to $5 a week to work. That's way too much money for them. They wanted people to work for $2.50. The American labor, who wanted the nicer houses and the nicer things, who wanted to have horses and maybe some land to grow some food on and some things that the American culture was emphasizing at the time. They wanted too much money, so the mines wanted to keep that labor rate down around the $2.50 to $2.80 range. And immigrants provided them the opportunity to do that because the mining company's perspective was, well, they don't get that much over there, so we're doing them a favor, by bringing them over here. They can work. The labor wages were described as generous by, of course, the companies and the newspapers of the time. But whether it was wages, how they controlled housing, of course, a lot of mining companies used locations where they owned the town around the mouth of a mine, and if you worked for the mine, you had housing. It was deducted from your pay, of course, and it was located on mining company property, and if you started a union or broke your leg or died, your widow and family would be evicted from the house because you don't actually own it. But it was still a method of creating a power structure that allowed the mining companies to control their financial situation. That's what they wanted. They wanted to control their financial situation, and controlling the human element was their method of doing that. And I'm not saying, I'm not going off on workers of the world just yet. But what I'm saying is, from their standpoint, this was a logical thing to do. U.S. Steel was formed almost with evangelist zeal by the industrialists of its time because it was going to revolutionize the efficiency of American business. It was going to create an entity that finally, once and for all, controlled the economy, kept the economy from going mad and having spikes and collapses that were putting people out of business left and right. U.S. Steel would bring order, and they would enforce this order using these people as their tools, essentially. What the immigrants found, and I won't get into the strikes and the labor strife. Again, that's over on the other track of this story with the book that I'm writing. But what immigrants found is that they could not escape the octopus. That's why I call it the inescapable octopus. I'd highlight, if you recall your American history class in school, you might recall these old political cartoons. They were often drawn in relation to Standard Oil. But these octopuses that would grab a hold of a monopoly. And the thing about an octopus, I've never personally fought an octopus. Maybe someday. But I presume that if one is fighting an octopus, it would be very difficult. Because 8 legs, and as you recall, it's Christmas season, so what's that movie? Love Actually. 8 is a lot of legs, David. 8 is a lot of legs. Reference, anybody? No. Again, some of these references just, when I'm at work and I'm talking to 18-year-olds, my jokes fail for entirely different reasons. So anyway, I got to find that sweet spot somewhere. When you fight an octopus and you take your hand and you grab one of those tentacles and you hold it away so it can't get you, and you grab that other tentacle and you've got these tentacles now, you're winning, there are more legs coming. You can't escape it. So they came from the old country and they came to the Mesabi Range, and they realized that the mines had control of their lives, not unlike the European regimes had control of their lives back home. Well, let's look around. Let's go up to the Vermilion Range. They had opened the Cuyuna Range down by Crosby and Ironton, maybe around that time, late teens. Maybe let's go down there. Well, it's the same company doing the same things. Let's get out of here. Let's go out west. They've got copper mines out there, all kinds of mines. It's even worse out there. One of the fascinating things I found about my story is that at one point the Power family, the people that I was researching, were planning their own escape from Hibbing to go down to Bisbee, Arizona, and become mining tycoons down on a new copper range down there in Cananea, Mexico. And they arrived and started wheeling dealing right around the time that all of the Mexican workers of Cananea rose up and held a major labor uprising in Mexico that required Mexico to ask for help from a bunch of American vigilantes to come across the border and put down the strike. And those Mexican workers wanted $3 a day, and they wanted the right to get promotions to the skilled positions like equipment operators and foremen. And I mention this because this is what interested me about it, is they wanted the same exact things that the workers back in Hibbing wanted. Only those workers were from Europe. So this is a global condition. And so they go to the big cities. It's much the same. Minneapolis viewed the Steel Trust as just as in a controlling fashion as the mining companies did, because the Steel Trust controlled access to all kinds of things. Manufacturers were at the whim of the steelmaker. And so U.S. Steel had tremendous power everywhere you went. So what are you going to do? Go back to the old country? What if you can't? They were stuck. So this is just getting me to the part I wanted to talk about regarding power. This presentation mentions race and it mentions justice, and these are terms that we've been discussing, particularly these last several years, as those issues, which have always been around, have come back to the forefront. But one of the things that I found in discussing race and justice as it relates to this part of the story is that what we're really talking about is that thing I was looking for, which is power. What is the notion of power? Who has the power? Why do they have the power? How do they get to use the power? And can other people who don't have the power get it somehow? Can they? And that's where I would highlight a couple of things. One of them was facing hardship, as these people did. People tended to want to sort. They wanted to sort into their communities. There was a lot of pride, and ethnic pride in range communities. I'd say it's less prevalent now, but even when I was growing up in the 80s, it was prevalent enough that when I went to the Forbes Elementary School, teachers still asked, "What are you?" When you did the roll call at the first day of school. What are you? And of course, the answer is you're Finn, or you're maybe Norwegian, or whatever. Cherry was all Finns. The Forbes Cherry Metroplex was very Finnish. But of course, the companies didn't want you sorting by class. That's why they suppressed the unions. So you can't do that. And they also found that the racial, ethnic, and cultural divisions, they became part of a broader story of unity that they wanted to sell. The notion of Americanism that was crafted really by U.S. Steel, not just U.S. Steel, but the entire American industrial complex. Because remember, men like Judge Elbert Gary, one of the founding leaders of U.S. Steel, and if you read some of his writing from 1918 or 1920, or towards the end of his life in 1924 or so, he's talking about industry the way some of us might talk about church. He believed that industry was this great unifier and that it was fundamentally tied to Christianity and it was fundamentally tied to America. And what we find with this kind of power structure is there's only these rare moments where we get to break out. Oops. So just talking a little bit about where this is going, I'm going to start talking about the ethnic background story of these workers. The thing about these workers coming in is that immediately they were starting to be sorted into categories that would be roughly described as black and white. This is one of the parts of the story that I wasn't looking for, that I had no plans to find, but that I couldn't escape. There was a hierarchy, and I don't know, again, making a reference that maybe nobody else will get, but because I review episodes of the TV show Fargo, and I would refer back to season 4 of Fargo. Again, there's 3 of you who watch that show. But in that show, they depict organized crime families taking over and ruling the city of Kansas City. And first, there were these Jewish merchants that had this crime family. And they were displaced by the Irish. The loathed and poor Irish rose up and took over. And the Irish were displaced by the Italians, the mafia. They came in next. And then the story takes off where African American crime family now wants to muscle in on the Italians. And it's the story of what's the dynamic of the powerless then rising up to take over the powerful. Well, there's a version of that happened here. The immigrants that came first, and these were a lot of Germans. Hibbing is a German town, for instance. It was named for a German who founded the town. And it was mostly German, especially in its early history. A lot of German ancestry in that town, and a lot of range towns. So Germany, Norway, Sweden. A few northern Italians, again, if you know Italian ethnic rivalries, you know there's a difference. But and a handful of Finns that came early for reasons of political turmoil in Finland, and a handful of these groups, and they were here first, not first, but they were here on the first trains coming in as immigrants. Well, as they established themselves over a period of a couple years, they got to be starting thinking of themselves as members of the normal American class of people who live in a place like Hibbing. Then comes 1913, and it's that massive influx. And these workers are coming from southern Italy. They're coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. Not just the former Yugoslavia, but also Hungary and what they called Bohemia. And in fact, the racial slur bohunk comes from the broad term referring to all of these groups from southeastern Europe. And that was a group of people that came later, less power, less status than the immigrants who came first, who still themselves were still immigrants and still not the same thing as those Irish and Englishmen who came from Michigan. They were a class above that. And then, of course, a class above that, you have the old New England genteel business people who came with the early Minnesota statehood. You can follow this hierarchy up and down the scale. And the thing about it is, there is a line on that scale where the people of the time considered it black or white. You know, you could have immigrants, some of them were white, some of them were black. The difference wasn't their skin color. Sometimes there were skin colorations involved, but it was more about an attitude of who was acceptable and who wasn't. And this maybe helps people understand racism a little differently, in that racism is different than prejudice in this way. Racism is about a power structure that projects itself down on people who have less power. And that's what was happening here. It was a power structure where there were expendables, and then there were people that were all right. If they put in about 20 years, maybe we'll let them be on the school board. And then there were people that were like, cool. They were like, you know, we're the founders. We're the pioneers, they called them. And so this hierarchy existed. And you better believe that the people in the hierarchy knew where they were. And if you were on the bottom, you did not like it. Paul Morris, the man I mentioned earlier, who scammed the mines, brought in all the immigrant groups, bootlegged and did all that, he was in open rebellion against the status of the Croatians. But he did it his own way. He loved money, he loved making money, he loved having fun. And so he did it his way. But he was fighting against, he was just obsessed with status and wealth, and he wanted to prove that a Croatian like him belonged alongside these other people like his friend Victor Power. Victor Power rose to his position as a populist political leader simply by befriending the people that his fellow Irish and Englishmen wouldn't befriend. And that made him powerful, small p powerful. So I put race problem in quotes. Actually, the official terminology used in the article that I saw was the Negro problem. But I chose to call it the race problem. And I want to highlight that in 1915, a person who maybe 4 months earlier was in, let's say, Sarajevo or some small town in the mountains of Croatia, could have been in Hibbing now, working in the mines, and might have walked down the streets of Hibbing, past the Power Theater, owned by Victor's brother Walter, and might have seen that poster, 1915, The Birth of a Nation. Now, this isn't now I'm a film professor all of a sudden, but I'm actually a communications professor. I'm way out of my element. But they would have walked by and seen this poster. Birth of a Nation was pitched as the first great epic movie, the first full-length orchestrated with music and beautiful scenery and massive sets and a massive cast of extras, reenacting scenes from the Civil War, which was something that everybody in this generation looked back on as this big event in maybe their own lifetimes, but certainly their parents' lifetimes. It was this big epic. And a nice old epic about the Civil War, cool, you know. What it was, if you've ever seen it, and I can't say I recommend it, it's a hard movie to watch because it's one of the most vile, racist movies ever, probably ever put to film. What its purpose was, D.W. Griffith's purpose was to create an alternate story about the end of the Civil War, depicting a world in which the defeated Confederates were right all along. They had the right idea, because look what happened. The freed black people couldn't possibly legislate or govern the South. In fact, they were practically not even human. Look at and they showed all of the racial stereotypes that you still encounter today about black people, and certainly the ones that persisted through the teens and 20s when Jim Crow laws and racial terrorism in the South were going on. These came from, or certainly magnified by, this movie. It was also influential in other ways. This is where I take an aside. If you've ever seen a Western where a cowboy rides up a ridge and towards the camera and then looks out at a scene that's behind the camera and you get this hero shot of the man on the horse, the first one to do that was Birth of a Nation. So you think about what an iconic image that is for American film, for all the movies that we grew up watching and enjoying, and how it came from this really vile racist movie. Immigrants didn't come here thinking about black and white, and they certainly weren't thinking about slavery or even the Civil War. These were all these are American problems, American things. We didn't, black people were different, sure, but so were the rich white people. They were all different to us because it's not what we're used to. But the idea that there is a hierarchy here, that there is, a class of people who can never be like the other class, this was introduced to them in America. So they saw Birth of a Nation. Most of the miners couldn't afford it, the ticket prices, but the influential people in town and some miners did see this. They certainly saw the posters. By the way, the reason there's a Klansman on the horse is because the movie exalts the Ku Klux Klan as the savior of America. Birth of a Nation refers to the birth of a nation led by the principles of the Ku Klux Klan. So when I say, I think I'm safe in saying that it's a pretty racist ideology. But this ideology ended up being applied to some of these lower status immigrants right here in our area. The two examples I would highlight, so when in 1917, the year after the big strike of 1916, the Industrial Workers of the World strike of 1916, in 1917 they had a series of hearings kind of breaking down what happened down in St. Paul. And one of the mining company policemen, in testimony to this committee, made a reference to a certain kind of miner, and he called them those black fellows. And he was referring to, broadly, the Austrian people, the Yugoslavian people, the Southern European people I referred to earlier. Where did that come from? And that was actually the story, get the citation right. David Levine wrote Black Fellows of the Saudi Iron Range, an article in a journal, the Journal of American Ethnic History. It was a really influential piece that I read in preparing for this, and actually that I found during my other research. This notion that there were these black fellows, and they were kind of like the role that in the South, because the South was being exalted in this time in a lot of American culture. So, okay, we're not the South, and there weren't a lot of black people on the range, though I will explain that there were some, and it was a reason why the population was so low. But they wanted to have the same society, the same hierarchical society, and so they assigned the lowest status people to be the black fellows. And that's a notion of race that didn't exist with these immigrants that they had to suddenly navigate. what is that? You know, how different am I from a Finn? Finns were in the middle, kind of. Some of them, the Sami Finns from northern Finland, who are more indigenous looking, were considered to be among the lower class of society. Now, the Swede Finns and the Finns that were more like the people from Sweden were considered different. But nevertheless, they were ranked in statuses. So this is the world that we came into. And so what immigrants were learning, because Americanization was very important to everybody. The mines wanted you to be American, the merchants, the schools wanted you to be American, and these immigrant families wanted to be American. So how do you become an American? Well, you have to not only become a citizen and maybe learn English, or have your children learn English at least, you also have to adopt these cultural ideas. And it sure seems like they don't like those black people. They don't seem to like them. And so this idea becomes planted in a society that wasn't even looking for it. Had nothing to do with the Civil War or slavery. So why weren't there as many black Americans in Hibbing as there were in other places? And I'm way out of my normal expertise area, but I'm just going to go to what I learned and saw in my research. This article here is an editorial in the Hibbing Daily Tribune, which was an anti-Klan newspaper, by the way, that nevertheless, I didn't have it up here, embraced eugenics, the racist theory that there was scientific differences between the races on matters of intelligence and morality and cleanliness and things like that. But they also said, I wanted to highlight this, I couldn't figure it out. Race feeling, whatever that means, anywhere in this country tends to increase with the percentage of Negroes. Many northern cities, as a result of Negro migration over the last few years, have been learning this for themselves. In other words, geez, people of another race come here, all of a sudden we have to think about race, Well, it's just kind of like, well, that's what happens when other people move to your area. But they were worried about this. This tells you kind of where the mindset of the town is. They're worried about what happens. Are we going to have a race problem if people come here who are black, especially from the South? The Android Hotel, which opened in 1921, was the finest, the most ornate hotel on the Iron Range in Hibbing. And early in its run, 1922, it hired an all-black wait staff to wear the kind of customary white uniforms that you might see in a hotel in a big city. The idea was, we're a big city now, and we're going to have, just like when you go to Chicago or St. Louis or Washington, D.C., we're going to have a black workforce to serve you and wait on you. But it was extremely unpopular with the local population. And while there's some really racist language in there that says that the people left of their own free will, in fact, that wasn't true. They were dismissed and sent away because of racial animus that existed in the community. This is another story. I get to mention Craigville. I don't know if anyone here knows Craigville. Up in northern Itasca County on the border with Kuchichin County was the town of Craig, which was not any organized town. It was a logging town that was essentially too far away from law enforcement for any of prohibition or a variety of other laws to be enforced. And my grandfather has stories about Craigville, and a lot of people who grew up, especially if you were young in the 40s or 50s, you probably went there because, no matter how old you were, you could go up there, you could drink, there was a brothel, literally nobody was checking. Anyway, Craig was just as wild back in 1926 as it was then, and a gentleman witnessed a duel. In fact, I write about a different duel in my microphone's messed up here, but I write about a different duel between two Montenegrins in my book, but that was supposed to be the only pistol duel recorded in Minnesota history. Well, actually, another one was witnessed in Craig, but the witness was black, and he came to Hibbing and told everybody about, hey, a man got killed. I saw it myself. And they threw him out of town because he was an unsavory element. And so that's the kind of thing. So there's this term that you hear, sundown communities, and that was that a person who was black had to be out of town by sundown. They could come through town, they might be able to go to the stores or use some of the services in the town, but by nightfall they had to be gone. Many times this was formally enforced by law enforcement. The city of Biwabik, for instance, was known as a sundown community with laws on the books that enforced that. Now, Hibbing and a lot of other range towns didn't have laws like that, but as you can see in this article, they were enforcing it as though they did. It was a cultural sundown community. And I mention this because there's a lot of evidence that there were black workers on the Iron Range. This was from 1913. Do you remember that series of articles about the labor shortage? If I could go back, I could put this article in between the worries about the labor shortage and when they brought in the Austrians. In between, the Great Northern Railroad brought in black workers to lay tracks for their railroad. They actually brought in lots of crews from all over the place. There were Japanese and Chinese crews that came in for the Great Northern, and railroads did this. They needed a lot of temporary workers or migrant workers to follow the tracks from sea to shining sea. And so they brought in workers from all over. This was quite scandalous, though, in the community of Hibbing, because in the article that I cut it off, but in the article they talk about the Oliver Iron Mining Company in the bottom of this story about a crew of black workers working in Kelly Lake, I think. They say that Oliver is considering bringing in 1,000 Negro workers from the South to come mine. And then, it wasn't necessarily depicted in the newspapers, something happened, that didn't occur. But all of a sudden those Austrians, who they also did not like, were suddenly okay. And they came in after that. So this racial division was used to pit people against each other. And the people were kind of pitted against each other such that they perceived themselves as rivals. And I mentioned in that power structure where there's limited resources, when you perceive someone as a rival, they can suddenly become an enemy. And from enemy, they could become someone you hate. And this was happening in other ways, but it was particularly prevalent on this topic of race. Which brings me to this. I knew there was KKK activity on the Iron Range. It's been documented. Some of you might know about it yourself. I did not know how much. Reading the daily newspapers from the period of 1913 to 1926, particularly from the release of Birth of a Nation in 1915 to really 1926, when I stopped reading the newspapers. It continued beyond that. But 1926 was a pivotal one I'll tell you about in a little bit here. This is just, I thought, how many of the Ku Klux Klan headlines should I put on this slide? Should I try to put all of them? I don't have room. This is maybe half of the ones I found on the newspapers I read in one town. So crosses from 1921 on were burning on mine dumps from Marble, Calumet, Nashwauk. Of course, Hibbing and Virginia were prominent locations. I didn't get as much about Grand Rapids, but I do know that there was a very active chapter here in Grand Rapids that was here. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, like I said, in the Birth of a Nation, we understand that the Klan was formed after the Civil War as a response to Reconstruction. But it quickly kind of faded away when it wasn't necessary. Once they had terrorized and destroyed black freedom in the South, they felt that their mission had been accomplished, and the guys no longer wanted to put the sheets on anymore. It just wasn't necessary. While Birth of a Nation made it cool to be in the Klan, especially if you had problems not only with African Americans, but also a wide range of other people, Jewish people and Catholic immigrants. Where were there a lot of Catholic immigrants? I mean, Hibbing was a majority Catholic immigrant town. And so this is a place where Klan activity formed very, very quickly. There's a couple of fascinating details about the Klan activity. You might understand that there were people who had very rigid ideas. Maybe they associated race with religion, and they had very profound religious ideology that tied into the more racist ideology. Some of that was there. We see some of that today. But interestingly, one gentleman, one county commissioner, Stunts Township commissioner, just outside Hibbing, concluded after going to witness a Klan rally that most of the people attending were not native-born Americans, but were in fact Northern European immigrants who had gone to become Protestant Northern European immigrants who were joining the Klan essentially because they were radicalized by the notion that they were going to be true Americans and these other immigrants were not going to be true Americans. And that is a fascinating story of how these lines are blurring now in the melting pot. Hatred becomes a ticket you can use to move up the ladder a little faster. So I just want to highlight that the Klan kidnapped a cop in Hibbing at gunpoint. They stopped his car, pointed guns at his wife and daughter and him, kidnapped him, took him to another location, and interrogated him because they thought he was spying on the Klan, which was active in a certain part of Hibbing, outside of town. Well, he lived in that part of Hibbing, and he lived just down the road. He was a farmer, and they let him go. He had to walk back to town where his wife and family had called the police. And guess what? Nobody was ever arrested. As far as I know, that was never prosecuted. So just that happened in Hibbing. That's just one of the crazy events. There were others involving these Klan activities and cross burnings, and election intimidation got to be a very big thing. This is The Empire Strikes Back, or maybe The Good Guys Strike Back, if a certain perspective. So that Commissioner Hayden was a guy, he was actually thrown out of office for corruption, but he was set up by the Oliver Mining Company because he was trying to raise wages. That was his claim. He also hated the Klan, and he was trying to unite the anti-Klan vote with that was his own publication, the Stunts Broadcaster. Just to highlight that the Klan activity was a really big part of politics, particularly around 1926, as later in the 20s. The New Tolerance Society, I think that was 1923, they formed a tolerance society that had members of the Farmer Labor Party, the Republican Party, and other independent political people. And so they had people from across the political spectrum who opposed the Klan were forming societies. Rufus Hitchcock, the publisher of the Hibbing Daily Tribune, was very anti-Klan and spoke out against them. Like I said, he was also kind of racist, but that was kind of the time. But he hated the Klan. There were a lot of ministers who went on record against the Klan. Of course, the Knights of Columbus and Hibbing became very vociferous opponents of the Klan, organized. When those burning crosses went up, men, often immigrant men, would charge up the sides of the dumps where these crosses were burning and put them out, not knowing if there were men with guns up there or anything. It was very courageous work, but they were that passionate when these things happened. They did not want to be intimidated. So I'm just putting this up there to highlight that this was not a universal belief. There was an understanding, even then, that there was a line being crossed with this kind of terrorist activity. So I'm nearing the finish point here as we talk about what happened in this period. But I'm kind of in the way here. There we go. So prejudices and traumas experienced by these immigrant families, like any trauma in a Minnesotan, gets swallowed down into our bellies and kept there. So we heard a lot of stories growing up, as I did, about immigrants, and it was hard. We didn't have much money, which is true. It was hard working in the mines. They worked us hard and they were unfair. True. But there was something else going on in this time, very personal to people, People were being judged. People were being sorted and discriminated against and experiencing hatred for no other reason than their identity, even among what we would now call a mostly white society. This affected people. And the kind of feelings that you go through is something that transmits through the generations. I've mentioned, and I've always find fascinating the Ojibwe story of the 7 generations. The notion that there are 3 generations before you, your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and then 3 generations after you, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. And you should really be thinking about that whole span when you think about life, when you think about culture. What that great-grandparent taught your grandparent, taught your parent, maybe taught you if they lived long enough, is now part of you. And you're giving it to your child, grandchild, and great-grandchild. You might not all meet each other personally, but it's part of your story. Well, we are well within the period of great-grandparents experiencing this, and either children or great-grandchildren still feeling the residual feelings of this. The idea, of course, there was a period of more class consciousness. The Depression changed a lot of things. A lot of the ethnic rivalries kind of gave way to this notion that if we all stick together, we're going to be okay. But that unity that makes the Iron Range so compelling in many ways was also unity that included a lot of the pain and trauma and hatreds that pre-existed that era. And that was, individuals varied, but these things were kind of baked in there. And I just want to close kind of on a personal level, the challenges that I'm talking about here, because this is why no one wants to talk about it. It's so hard. But my grandfather, who passed away just a couple of years ago, I was very close with him. He wanted a son more than anything. He had 6 girls. His oldest daughter had a child. It was a girl. And then I was born. And so he had this very special, he always took an interest in me, and we would go on adventures, and I got him in trouble because we would go to the bar, and I said, "Grandpa, can we go to the bar?" And he's like, no, don't talk about it, And we were very close. He was a miner. He was badly injured in a mining accident and was disabled the rest of his career. It was very hard for him to work, but he did. Had a lot of pain and physical pain at the end of his life. And he loved me, told me so, and I loved him, and it was a very special relationship. He also said and believed some of the most racist things I've ever heard. And this is really challenging to think about, because here's a person that I love saying something that I hate, that always struck me as wrong. And it was really challenging. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm not here to preach a political specific outcome. I don't know. I'm a I teach public speaking. But I do think that there's value in learning our past, learning what really happened, trying to break down myths and understand a little bit more about the things that were really happening, and then learning, and then, yes, still loving the people that we love, our past, our traditions, our history. We can love the amazing stories from the Iron Range's past. We can love the fact that we were part of building America, winning world wars, and all of the great stories, and the foods, and the culture, and the towns, and the sports teams, and all of that we can love. But then we also have to say we can let go. We can let go of the parts, the anger, the hatred, the things that were at the pit of our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents' stomachs, the things that they really struggled with for reasons that were sometimes out of their control. We can let their burden go. We can let it go. So that's where I'll conclude for today. We have some time for a question. Yes, sir.
So in your opinion, is this racism you're talking of back in that era caused from the iron mine's power, and then putting these nationalities together that can't speak to each other?
Yeah.
Or what is the cause of this racism?
The iron mines had silk gloves, and they kept themselves just a level away, just a breath away from the worst of the race baiting. The mines they found racism and the Klan, for instance, to be uncouth. Those guys they have to wear the robes, they're just out of line with the flaming crosses. It's like too much. But they weren't going to hire black workers. And so there was a racism at the core of what they were doing. And there was certainly ethnic rivalry that they liked to stoke. They liked to put people together at first who didn't speak the same language. And they also liked to make foremen people who didn't like the groups of people working for them. Actually, this is a story I forgot to tell. This is a kind of contemporary story. So you had these lower classes of workers, Austrians and the Slovenians and the Croatians and these folks and the Italians that were lower than the Norwegians and the Germans, for instance.
Why were they lower?
They were considered lower because they were more likely to be Catholic, for one. They were also culturally different than Northern Europe. There were cultural differences, ways of life that were just different enough to be reminiscent more of the East, or more of, more foreign to the appearance of the people. And because they were often, as you go further south into Italy and into the coast of Dalmatia, you do get some darker skin. Greeks were also treated this way, among the lowest of the low, among these groups. In part because the hierarchy, they wanted to create the hierarchy so that there could be people at the top and people at the bottom. There needed to be more at the bottom, so the people at the top felt even better. There was such a power disparity between the mining companies and everybody else that they wanted to create a world where they got to be the benevolent leaders, like kings of old, over everybody else. And if they became like us, if they adopted our religion, if they adopted our beliefs, we would elevate them. There were very few Chinese immigrants in Hibbing. Mostly they were associated with restaurants or laundries, except for one. There was a mining engineer named Wenping Pan who went by William Pan in Hibbing, and he became a mining engineer his whole career in Hibbing. He was a Methodist, and he became the chair of the Hibbing Republican Party. He fully adopted the American ideal, certainly the beliefs of his fellow miners. I think it wasn't something he did insincerely. He was from a Christian family in China, for instance, but he was a Chinese ethnic person, and he became William Pan, Bill, and he was a great tennis star. He actually had a chance to play in the Olympics for China back in the same year as Jesse Owens for America. But he was also a track athlete. He was the fastest man in China and their best tennis player in the early 1900s. He spent his life working as a mining engineer in Hibbing. But that's an example of what the mining company would have said is what we're trying to do here. See, we had this man, he's from a heathen country, and he wouldn't be considered among the higher status people coming off the boat. But look what he did with himself. He adopted all of our beliefs, and he became one of us. And that's what he believed too. I talked to his grandson. And that's not to diminish or take away from the life. He may well have wanted that for himself. That's not to take that away from him. But the mining company had a certain ideology attached to what they thought America was. And they wanted these immigrants to adopt that. The reason that the mining companies they resisted taxes in all forms except one, schools. And the reason is schools in the early 1900s were the great Americanizers of local society. They taught the English, they taught the ways of life, the home ec, the ways to cook, the ways to clean, the ways to dress. It all conformed, created the conformity that the mining companies wanted. The mining companies want to reduce variables. They actually don't want there to be any differences among people as long as they're willing to work for just slightly less than the market. That's what the mining company wanted. Yes.
I suppose maybe 40, 50 years ago, Virginia had an active Jewish community, a synagogue,
Yeah.
and then it faded away.
So did Hibbing, yeah.
Now, that's the question I was going to ask, because I think the synagogue in Virginia is a visitor center now. So at one time, did Hibbing actually have a fairly active Jewish community?
They did, yeah. They had a synagogue as well. Of course, famously, Bob Dylan was from Hibbing, Robert Zimmerman, and he had, actually at that time the Jewish community had grown small enough that they only had a visiting rabbi. I don't think that they had a permanent rabbi, but they did have a synagogue, and they had bar mitzvahs in the Androy Hotel, and there was a small community, mostly of merchants, who came early in the immigration of Hibbing. And that actually a lot of range towns had Jewish population, mostly small, mostly because they had come as merchants from overseas. They became merchants in America, and they went out across America finding opportunities to ply their trade. Of course, also kind of famously, one of the things that happened when we had planned communities like Coleraine, U.S. Steel, John C. Greenway. John C. Greenway is a fascinating individual historically, but he blocked Jewish business owners from working in Coleraine because it was a designed community for U.S. Steel. So like that's another example of the mining company, you know, maybe not putting out really racist rhetoric or things of that nature. Most of what they put out was generic, like America is great, let's all come together, work hard. If you work hard, you'll be rewarded. These are broad statements that we've all heard that were part of our story, and maybe they're not even bad, but they kind of cloaked a lot of activity that was either racist or anti-certain religions or things like that. They had policies kind of baked into their way of doing business. And that's, you know, when we talk about racism, and I'm not a sociologist, I'm just going to make that clear. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not technically a historian, though I kind of feel like one. And so when we talk about racism, you can't escape institutional racism as being part of the story. And what I mean by institutional racism is racism baked into laws, systems, and culture. And so you don't have the mining company espousing things that Birth of a Nation espouses, but you do have them creating model communities that exclude people by class or by religion. They do have a mostly Protestant leadership and foreman class and a mostly Catholic workforce. I called them earlier expendables. If you were an Austrian or a Croatian just off the boat onto a train up to Hibbing, you were going down in the underground. You were going to work the areas where the trams and the train cars were coming together. You were more likely to die in the first couple months of being here than any other workforce. And that's just built into their process. Yes?
Why did you start in 1913? Why not in 1900?
Because I had limited time. Victor Power was elected in 1913. Now, I won't say that I ignored previous years. What I didn't do was my project was to read every single daily newspaper for an 11 to 12 year period. There were two actually, and a weekly newspaper as well. So, and then the weekly became a daily, much to my chagrin in 1920. And so I read thousands of newspapers cover to cover.
Is the book going to be different than the podcast, the 10 series podcast?
Yes. The podcast does not mention the true end of the story, which, thank you for the segue. The end of the story has elements of what I showed you all tonight. Victor Power's final fight was against the Ku Klux Klan.
Thank you for coming, Aaron.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Oh, yeah, we got a little time. We can have some more questions. Yes, sir.
When will this podcast appear?
Yeah.
And
Well,
what will it be called so that I can plug it
yeah,
in?
I have some good news and some bad news. So the good news is the podcast is out and done. It's called Power in the Wilderness, available on the App Store or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all of your favorite podcast mediums. There are 10 episodes. I hosted it with Carl Jacob, a filmmaker from New York who's originally from Hibbing. And we made it during COVID using technology in my basement. He in his loft office and me in my basement. And that is a lovely product that doesn't quite get to the end of the story because at the time we recorded it, I hadn't finished the research. I literally just plowed straight through. The book, I think, will also be called Power in the Wilderness. Is going to be published by the University of Minnesota Press. And the publication date was supposed to be 2022. Oh, wait, it's not 2022 anymore. In fact, we're well past my deadline because, again, I'm whining now. But when you read that much stuff and you get all hopped up on as many topics, you might notice that I love the context and the offshoots of these stories. I signed a contract for a 125,000 word book, and I produced a 290,000 word book. And paper is expensive right now, they're telling me. So paper and ink, way up, ironically, even as our paper industry struggles. I'll get into that some other time. Yes?
Hey, I got a real side trip for you.
Yeah, hey, Scott.
And I don't know if it's true.
Okay.
I have a friend from Hibbing who told me many years ago that Roger Maris was actually Maris, M-A-R-A-S.
Yes.
Born in Kelly Lake, and I was wondering if Maris was a descendant of this Paul Maris.
Great question, Scott. Yes. Roger Maris, who was born in Hibbing, raised in North Dakota, who for a long time held the single-season home run record for the New York Yankees and also played for the Cardinals, I want to highlight for Scott's benefit. Yeah. Was born Maris, I think, or no, his father changed the name. And he might have been born Maris, but the father was a Maris. There were 4 or 5 brothers, all saloon keepers, who all came. Paul was the oldest, and they came with Paul. They worked for him at first, and they all went out on their own. The Marises that Roger's Marises, grew tired of Paul's gangsterism, for lack of another term. They were prolific bootleggers, and one of the Maris brothers felt he wanted to create some separation from his family's business during Prohibition, changed his name to Maris, and then they moved to North Dakota. Yeah. So Roger is the nephew of Paul Maris. Yeah. Cool. Other questions? It's really great to see. I see some new people I haven't met before. I see familiar faces, a lot of colleagues from our new Minnesota North family. I will say that I cursed a lot of things about when we used to have our own private little colleges, and it was wonderful. And I cursed a lot of things about coming together at first. One of them was star IDs. You all don't know about star IDs, but you have to change the password every 3 days, and you can log into any computer using your star ID. And like, what's the point of this? I walked in here today to my sister campus here at Itasca, and I logged right into that computer using my star ID, and I get it now. It's actually that part's kind of cool. Yeah. I work in Hibbing at the Hibbing campus, so yes.
What was the goal of the groups that were active in the Ku Klux Klan? What were they trying to do here?
They were, I think practically they were trying to intimidate immigrants from voting. So a lot of the Catholic immigrant groups that I'm talking about the people weren't citizens. The children were, because they were born here. But the fathers and the mothers, when the mothers could vote, were in many cases never got citizenship. Some of them never learned English. And the thing is, they couldn't vote in federal or state elections because they weren't citizens. But in a lot of these villages, they could vote. They could vote in school board and local races. So a lot of these Klan activities were about scaring immigrants from voting or trying to vote in local elections. They were often put up the night before big elections to scare the immigrants. Yes?
They scared immigrants, but were there any murders or Klan involved in anything like that, or was it just disturbance?
I don't know. Did they ever kill somebody? They kidnapped a cop. They certainly menaced people. There were a lot of people who were found dead hanging in the woods, some suicide, some not. Some, when they were moving Hibbing and they tore up the old town, these kids went playing down in this old sewer and they found a suitcase deep in this stinky, reeking sewer. They were exploring and they opened the suitcase and it was a desiccated man curled up inside the suitcase. I don't think he put himself in there. So, I mean, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. They cut down a lot of skeletons, I got to tell you. Every spring, the skeletons got cut down from the trees.
Is that in the paper?
Yeah. A lot of imagery. Sorry, I speak so glibly of it, but it was my life for COVID. I was reading this stuff. I've lost all sense of like social boundaries. Like other people are probably profoundly disturbed by skeletons hanging in the woods, but I'm like, it's just March, that's all. You know, that's what happens. The birds ate the rest. Yeah.
I think you talked a little bit about this. Maybe you could say a bit more when obviously the unions got going.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent did the unions buy into the class, the sorting, or to what extent did they cut across that?
Beautiful question. I could give another lecture about labor that I won't be giving tonight, but it was fascinating. The labor dynamic, say in 1916, where the industrial workers of the world organized about 10,000 mostly immigrant workers as miners. What Victor Power and a lot of the mainstream labor advocates wanted was not for that. The industrial workers of the world were radicals. They were communist socialists. They were radicals, and a lot of people were just not going to tolerate them, especially powerful people. But they wanted the American Federation of Labor, quote unquote, reputable labor groups to come in and organize the mines. The problem was the AFL was in fact divided over questions of race. The AFL could not figure out how to admit black workers, which hurt them in the Twin Cities. And they could not figure out how to incorporate foreign language speaking workers to their ranks. Again, I don't know how much. One of the fascinating details I found was that Victor Power lost a congressional race in 1924 for many reasons, not least of which was his public alcoholism. But one of the things that was going on was the Farmer Labor Party was his opposition. He was a Republican, but he had come up from a labor tradition. But now there was this new upstart Farmer Labor Party, which was much more pro-labor even than Vic Power. So he lost to a Farmer Labor candidate, but he lost in part because it was the same year that there was a presidential race in which there was a Progressive Party candidate, Robert La Follette. I'm sorry for going into this depth. But Robert La Follette was running for president on the progressive ticket. They actually thought he might win Minnesota, because Minnesota was a progressive state. He did not win Minnesota or any other state, not even his home state of Wisconsin. But one of the reasons was, in the labor movement, there was a defined lurch to the right before the election. And one of the things in a letter I found from a farmer labor campaign worker to Congressman William Carse, the guy who beat Vic Power, was a complaint that said, you all know what happened in 24. All of our guys were going to vote for La Follette. They were going to go straight ticket progressive. And then they went out to those meetings on the edge of town, and they came back and they wouldn't campaign for La Follette anymore. And he's talking about the Klan. So that is something kind of profound when you think about that. We always today associate labor with more progressive politics. But in its earliest days, as they were sorting out the AFL and the CIO, which is the radical side, it wasn't AFL-CIO yet. The steelworkers were born of a radical union. And now I would observe that they've become rather more conservative. But their origin was very radical. And so there was a big divide in labor. It's the reason the strike failed in many ways, because the AFL held back their support. because those were the radicals. And they wanted to organize the mines, even though they actually wouldn't do it because they were afraid of the mines. Sorry.
Was the IWW more inclusive?
Yes, they were very inclusive, but they were politically less palatable to the mainstream of American political life. Victor Power never fully embraced them because he knew that would be the end of his weird labor business coalition that he had formed. And so he talked to them, but he kept them just an arm's length away. It also hurt him because the miners who were striking saw him as not quite as supportive as they would have liked him to be. Ended up costing him the mayor's race in 1922. There's so much more I could talk about. Ask me anything.
Is Vic Power the namesake of Powers Hill
In Hibbing?
in Grand Rapids here?
No. There was a big logging guy named Powers. So the Powers-Simpson Road that goes from Hibbing out to Itasca County used to be the main way to get to Itasca County. Now it's just this weird little road back by Day Lake. It kind of goes out. It might have connected with what we now call 65 at one time somewhere. But it, or maybe Stingy Lake, somewhere up there. Anyway, that was the Powers. Big logging guy named Powers. There's a lot of guys named Power or Powers from Waterford. It has to do with the Vikings. I could go on. All right. Well, thank you so much. You've been very patient with my ramblings. Thank you.